today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this, an unexpected bit of news. Taylor versus Serrano II is next. Eddie Hearn on Katie Taylor. There's a good chance she could fight Amanda Serrano next. We have opened a dialogue with their team, and we'll see how they progress. I think it's the fight that makes the most sense for Katie as a courtesy of No Smoke Boxing, who recently sat down with Eddie Hearn and talked about a variety of things. This was one among them. I guess this explains why talks have recently slowed for what was supposed to be a Chantel Cameron trilogy. Now we know what may have been happening in the background that delayed that fight, a potential Serrano rematch. Myself, I don't have a preference. I like a Cameron trilogy just as much as I like a Serrano rematch. I like both fights.
Immediately after the first one, there was a desire to see a second.
And there was going to be a rematch, but you will recall that Amanda got injured, she had to withdraw, and Katie ended up fighting Chantel Cameron 2 times instead. Now that that's all said and done, Amanda's back on the table.
Remember, they made the rematch. They made the fight.
And there was a palpable desire to see it due to the aesthetic of the first fight, of the first one. It was a crowd pleaser. Nobody really lost that night. Even though Katie Taylor got the decision, there were plenty of people who thought Amanda did enough and Amanda should have got the decision, which set the precedent for a second fight, a potential rematch. This would presumably take place on the undercard of the upcoming Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson exhibition match, which will go down on the Netflix platform in front of their over 200 million subscribers for no additional charge. You will be able to see that as part of your existing Netflix subscription.
A clever bit of strategy.
Because boxing was at its biggest in this country when it was most accessible to the common man, to the consumer. The advent of closed-circuit television and pay-per-view fights over time, decade by decade, minimized the size of the audience here in America because the proliferation of fights like that became too expensive for the common man.
Now the market's oversaturated.
With pay-per-views that aren't really pay-per-view worthy, and it's not a coincidence that the market for boxing in America now is smaller than it was in previous generations. That has everything to do, the powers that be and all their greed, turning boxing into a luxury item for the consumer where it's supposed to be a poor man's sport.
Luxury item is right.
Between monthly and annual subscriptions and the additional charge for a box office fight, how much money would it come out to if you had to purchase every single box office fight that goes down in a calendar year? Needless to say, in this economy and these trying times, your average boxing fan doesn't have the disposable income to purchase every single pay-per-view on the calendar, making this a clever bit of strategy.
This card isn't a pay-per-view.
Making it that much more accessible to that many more people, that many more Netflix subscribers, and as stated, the correlation between a dwindling audience for boxing in America and the oversaturation of the market with pay-per-views makes this decision ingenious, that this is not a pay-per-view. Granted, that to many, it's going to seem like a circus fight between a faded fighter who shouldn't even be fighting and a social media influencer. It's a spectacle.
But it doesn't pretend to be anything else.
And it not costing you $80 like some other spectacles and some other circus fights we've seen in recent years makes it that much more appealing, that much more attractive, that you get to see it, whether you like it or not, as part of your existing Netflix subscription. Taylor versus Serrano II is the perfect addition to that show.
Because that's a serious fight between two very serious competitors, two of the best in the sport. Katie and Amanda are the number 1 and number 2 pound-for-pound fighters on the current Ring IQ pound-for-pound list.
I've no doubts the event coordinators, the people at Netflix and Most Valuable Promotions are going to make it worth their while financially
to get them back in the ring.
And this would presumably be at 140 pounds for Katie Taylor's undisputed crown, as I sincerely doubt at this age Katie can get down to 126, get down to featherweight. In all likelihood, Amanda will be the one moving up.
She's fought there before and held a title there before, very briefly, back there in 2018.
6 years ago, opposite the ring, Yamila Reynoso for what was the vacant WBO title. Amanda won it And even though she won't be in unfamiliar territory, it has been a long time since she's been there. We all know Amanda, she's not a true 140-pounder, but she punches so hard.
Her power carries, her skill carries.
So I think she'll be the one moving up, and I think it'll be for Katie's belts. I think that a lot of people saw the first fight between them. Even more may end up watching the second because Netflix, compared to DAZN, is a much bigger platform.
More importantly, this isn't tucked behind a paywall. This isn't a pay-per-view. So it's that much easier for all those Netflix subscribers to watch it.
And that's the key factor. It's accessible to a lot of people.
That's the game changer.
I understand that in some ways this leaves Chantal Cameron out there in the cold, but she can always move up to 147 and fight Sandy Ryan. They do have some unfinished business.
Bottom line, I like the fight.
So we've talked about the virtues of billing the Tyson versus Paul card as a non-pay-per-view, but let's talk about one fight that was. Let's talk about the Tszyu versus Fundora numbers, what they are and what they aren't. Her boxing insider, Rick Glaser. Many are asking about the Fundora versus Tszyu pay-per-view number. It seems as if Amazon and PBC are hiding the number, which in reality is, it's so low, it's an embarrassment. My source that I have gotten the pay-per-view numbers from since July of 2004, an LA-based entertainment attorney saying it probably set an all-time low. Who was buying that? Even the PBC operatives who float those phony high pay-per-view numbers are completely silent on this one. I believe it completely tanked on pay-per-view. Like, way under the 50,000 pay-per-view buys. Not a good sign for the floundering PBC. Artistically, it was a very good show, but financially, it was obviously a disaster. Not the first time we've seen a complete gag order, radio silence, in reference to a PBC pay-per-view. That's what happened with the Davis versus Cruz numbers. Isaac Cruz,
a late replacement for Rolly Romero, but 2 years ago. They never published a set of numbers for that fight.
It's one of those instances to where what you don't say really says it all. That the same people that still brag about their success with Floyd Mayweather years ago weren't bragging about the numbers to that fight.
Or this one.
The rule of thumb being that if you had something to brag about, you'd be bragging about it. And what was the kickoff show for your Amazon deal were the fights entertaining fights? And was the show an entertaining show? I would say it was, but it was grossly overpriced because what you have to remember is they're not the only game in town. You didn't have to pay $70 to see Oscar Valdez versus Liam Wilson, and that was a great fight. That was an excellent fight. So was Artur Beterbiev versus Callum Smith.
The list goes on.
There are lots of great fights that are happening, entertaining ones that don't cost you $70, $75. But this card did.
Why?
What's supposed to make this card so special, or what was supposed to make this card so special that you should have to pay so much more to see it? That's the question the consumer has to ask themselves. And what we see is that
less and less people are buying them.
I got nothing against Tim Tszyu. I'm a fan of Tim Tszyu. But you don't fly halfway around the world for opponents like Erickson Lubin or a faded Keith Thurman or a late replacement in Sebastian Fundora. You don't fly halfway around the world to fight people like this who aren't draws in their own country, in their own neck of the woods, and then put the fight behind a paywall, especially when you yourself aren't a big draw here. You're a big draw in Australia.
Maybe you should have did the fight there.
It doesn't make sense for Tszyu to come here to fight those guys. Maybe if it were Crawford,
Canelo,
but not Sebastian Fundora or anybody like him. Economically, it just doesn't make sense. It never made sense.
Well, he was a late replacement.
Yeah, he was standing in for Keith Thurman, and that didn't make sense either.
Bottom line,
pay-per-view as a source of revenue was never intended for everybody or just anybody.
It wasn't.
It really should be exclusive to the biggest of the big fights or the biggest of the big names that have a grassroots demand that make them bankable.
The way it's used.
These days, it's used as a resort to satisfy the inflated purse demands of the fighters and their teams that insist on wanting more money than they are actually worth.
It's something that the promoters resort to try and generate additional money that they themselves don't have.
And you know what? If you don't have the money to do a Tszyu versus Fundora fight as a regular fight in America, maybe you shouldn't do it in America. Maybe you should have Sebastian or Keith or whoever it is fly out to Australia,
where you can bill it as a pay-per-view, where you can sell a lot of tickets and you won't have to paper the house.
I don't begrudge Tim and his team trying to break into a new market, but frankly, they're going about it the wrong way with the wrong people.
And it backfired.
Who impact decisions for the fights that do go to the decision, and so how do we fix it? I mean, I don't know, man. I mean, I feel like I'm personally myself think the judges are on the take. I don't think a guy who watches that many fights can be that stupid, or has worked in the business for that long can be that stupid. I personally, my opinion is that there are judges that are on the take, and they can be on the take in different ways. They may get money under the table the old-fashioned way. They may get flown in on first-class flights and put in five-star hotels. I've heard through the grapevine things like hookers given to these people, great fancy dinners. I don't know, whatever it is. Again, I could go on and on and on in terms of the theories. One thing that's not a theory, one thing is a fact, though. There's judges who pretty consistently make some horrible, horrible decisions. And I am not sure if something has to change in this judging style, the 10-point must system, the way judges are positioned, or if there's a criminal element, like I said, and they may be on the take.
The notion of reform in the sport of boxing as it pertains to how a round and how a fight is scored seems a romanticized idea to me, almost naive.
Idealistic.
Boxing fans have been at odds with professional judges in the sport of boxing since the days of black and white television and before that. There's always someone in the stands screaming bloody robbery, highway robbery. And in spite of this having been a prevalent problem in the sport for so many decades, for such a long time, the problem still exists.
Yes.
Persists in this modern day and age to where you can't just chalk it up to a judge having an off night. It's really not ineptitude.
That tired old cookie cutter answer.
Perhaps in some instances it is, but in others it so clearly isn't. It's deliberate. When you think about the recent Rolly Romero versus Isaac Cruz fight and how one of the three judges actually had Rolly Romero up on their card.
What?
Chris Flores.
Off night.
Is that what that was? And what about Gloria Martinez Rizzo over a year ago in the Gabriel Maestre versus Mikhail Fox fight?
Off night.
Is that what that was? Another off night. What about the CJ Ross 114 versus 114 scorecard in the Mayweather versus Canelo Alvarez fight? That was an off night too.
Is that what that was supposed to be?
I can understand a judge being off by a round in what is a close and competitive fight, as close fights really aren't robberies, that cliche. But in these situations, these instances, it seems less like ineptitude and more like corruption. And that's what Paulie Malignaggi cites when trying to imagine reform, a means to get the boxing judges on the same page as the boxing community at large, the spectators in what is the spectator sport.
Because they so often disagree.
Sometimes wildly, imagining a solution to ensure that everybody's on the same page. Maybe you have the three judges not sitting all together on one side of the ring, but sitting separately on three separate sides of the ring to get three separate vantage points of the action to more accurately score about.
Around.
Three guys sitting on one side of the ring is three guys that have the same vantage point. Thus, what may obscure the view for one may obscure the view for all if they're all on the same side. But if they're on three separate sides, that's three separate vantage points to get a fix on what's happening.
It's one way you could do it.
Imagining a solution to get the boxing judges on the same page as the boxing fans, that's one way you could try and help that situation. And yet another way is you don't have the judges sitting ringside at all. You have them scoring the feed that is streamed to the fight fans at home, as it gives you every vantage point of the fight instead of just one.
The ringside angle.
You have all three judges sitting separately, somewhere in a room, scoring the feed, as opposed to sitting ringside, scoring the fight.
It's yet another way you could do it.
But again, that seems wide-eyed and naive to me, idealistic, because that suggests that it all boils down to human error and not something else, something far more nefarious, like corruption. And I, like Paulie Malignaggi, believe in some instances it's brazen, it's
corruption. It's not a logistics issue. So for you to tackle it that way would suggest that it's just a case of human error, a judge or some judges having an off night, when in reality what it is, they made up their mind how they were going to score those fights before the fight even started, because they were paid to. And that's not a logistics issue. It's got nothing to do with an obscured view or vantage points or anything like that. There are people that are on the take, and when a judge like Chris Flores actually has Rolly Romero up on his card as opposed to the other two judges, what you really have to ask yourself is, how do you hold him accountable? There's no way a judge in his right mind could have had Rolly Romero win in that fight. One did. How? For having done what? You would have to ask Chris Flores. And with rounds and how they're scored open to interpretation, it creates that gray area where the corruption can live, where it can thrive. So what do? How do you make it to where all three judges have to be more or less on the same page when the way rounds are scored is open to interpretation? Each individual's interpretation of a round, of the fight. To tackle corruption, or the possibility of it. To solve a problem, you have to identify what it is. And you can't solve potential corruption within the sport of boxing and how rounds are scored by tackling it like it's a logistics issue. It's disguised as a logistics issue, but that's not what it really is. Moreover, who says they want to? To tackle this issue, to really nip it in the bud, you would need the cooperation of the fighters, their managers, their promoters, the sanctioning bodies, the local commissions. You would need all hands on deck for this. They all have to want it. But who says they do? Who's to say that the promoters and the people in boxing themselves don't want to leave that door open to resort to that if they deem it necessary? To protect their fighter. Their investment. If what we're talking about is corruption, corruption comes from within. So maybe you make it to where if one judge's scorecard is drastically different than the other two judges, they're held for review, but even if they are, that doesn't reverse the outcome. Doesn't undo the damage. There already is a set criterion to score a round, to score a fight, and yet the corruption persists. Harsher penalties towards a judge who scores a round drastically different than the other two do. Maybe that could serve as a deterrent for potential corruption in the future. That you can't go giving a guy a whole bunch of rounds without suffering a consequence as a result, making it more difficult for the judges to disguise what it is they're up to. It's no easy fix. It's not an easy problem to solve, because if it were, they would have solved it by now. Or maybe the reason they haven't solved it by now is because they really don't want to. Maybe some of the people in boxing would like to leave that door open if that's something they have to resort to.